Alright, so I already know what some of the comments may be about this video, so let me say very clearly, shimming a cylinder is not a bypass technique. We don't teach bypass techniques, or I don't at least, nor will anyone at lockreference.com. This is a cylinder servicing technique. This is what you need to break down the cylinder when you've already got it in hand, off the door, off the lock. This is what you're going to need to break it down if you don't have a working key at your disposal. This is very common if you're called to rekey a lock where no operating keys exist, and you're basically tasked with not only rekeying it but providing new keys that do exist. In order to break them down, you're going to need to rotate the plug some way, and there are multiple ways to do that, but by far the most popular way is shimming. And now the way shimming works, and I've got a very crude representation right here. You see in the fifth chamber I've got a pin. Now this is called a shim. Shim gets inserted to the back of the cylinder and rests right along the plug. As you can see, it's got a curvature to it, if you can pick that up. And by manipulating or lifting or lowering an individual pin stack at a time, you can create a moment where either the bottom pin and the master pin, or top pins, whatever the case may be, where by lifting and lowering it while pressing the shim against the stack, not too hard, you can cause a momentary separation at the shear line itself, where the shim slides right over it, and then you continue down the plug until eventually all chambers will be shimmed and the plug can be rotated and disassembly can continue. It's a very simple process, very easy. In that example, I'm using a key blank. You don't have to. A lot of people do. Some people use picks or other similar probing tools. It's up to you. I've done both, no wrong or right. So let's go through a basic, or my technique for shimming. I don't know if it's any different or any special, but I'll just show you what I do and you can stick with it or poo-poo me, I don't care. First thing we need to do to get to the back of the plug itself and the shear line is we're going to need to remove, in this case it's a key and lever cylinder, we're going to need to remove the cap, tailpiece, spring, retaining pin, all that. With a Mortise cylinder it's the same. You remove the cam and the two screws, and that gives you access to the back of the cylinder. And then what we're going to do, since I'm using a key in this example, actually let me back up. I messed up. Always lubricate first. I was testing you. Hold mine upside down like I discussed in the pinning small format, because that allows the lubricant to get to the entire pin stack and really work its way in. And then what I'll do is, after I lubricate it, I'll run the key blank in and out a few times. This one's a special key blank, I guess. It's an L keyway Schlage, which is their all-section key for the obverse family. As you can see, it's a very thin key because it has to pass through all those key sections, and that's why it's made out of steel. If you do a lot of Schlage work with the obverse keyway families, you know, C, CE, so on and so forth, good idea to get one of these, put it in your shop or truck. Not only allows you to pass through all those keyways, but it's steel, so it's going to last you and it's going to hold up. So once we've got it lubricated and everything's moving sufficiently, or as best to be expected, we're going to insert the shim through the rear of the cylinder between the Bible and the plug itself. And then I'm going to push the key blank all the way in until it makes contact with that first pin stack. And while I'm pushing on the shim from the rear, I'm going to move the key blank in and out, and see I've already set that particular chamber. And then we're just going to keep going on down the line, and I've already got, that's the second one. You can hear it click. There's the third one. Fourth, fifth. Back out the blank a little bit, and there's six, and I've turned, and now I've got it, the plug turned, so I can disassemble it. That simple, very simple, nothing to it. I guess a few techniques I can share, not that this is really secretive at all. Not a lot of pressure needs to be applied. If you apply too much, this is exactly what will happen right here. I'll bend it, okay? And if you do that too hard or too often, this isn't going to be very straight, your shim. You can repair them, I guess, so to speak. What I'll do is I'll place it between my thumb and index finger at the side of the bend, and then I'll just kind of press to reinforce the original curvature of it, and that'll get you some additional use out of it. Another thing too, over time the edges will start to roll over, and they're not going to be very good to split the pin stack. Now that's not necessarily indicative of your technique, just happens over time, making constant interaction with the pin stacks. Now if you do it too hard and you're too heavy-handed with it, yeah, definitely that'll happen. A few ways to repair that as well. Number one, you can take a pair of scissors and clip it. You got to be sure to have sharp scissors, because what happens if they're dull at all, it's going to roll that edge over as well, and you'll basically be back where you were. Another way to do it is, if you can imagine that this is a grinding wheel and it's rotating towards us, take your shim and then just very lightly hit the grinding wheel, and that'll remove those burrs and clean up the edge for you. Get a lot of reuse out of these. Not uncommon to have the same shim on your truck for multiple months at a time. I used to see how long I could do it just for my own giggles, and you can really prolong the use of these things and get a lot of use out of them. So again, we'll just go through this one really quick. Shimming from the back, very light pressure. Gonna let the key do most of the work, and I'm already almost all the way through. I got one left. There. There. And you can kind of use the, be careful for that. You can always use the pin stacks kind of as a feedback. You'll know when you successfully shim one. The shim will move forward towards the front of the plug. Another thing to keep in mind with cylinders that utilize security pins, specifically spools, if you're shimming a cylinder that has those, there's a chance that you can hit the side of the spool or the small portion of it and get your shims caught, and you'll be thinking, oh, I've got this one set because it moved forward a little bit, and now I'm going on to the next one. Well, what happens is when you're trying to shim the next cylinder, despite moving the key in and out a million times, you can't get it to set. And what you basically need to do is just back out from the last one you set and start over. Takes a little bit of practice and feel to get it, but you'll soon learn the difference between the amount of movement that occurs when you shim a normal pin stack as opposed to security pins. So just something else to keep in mind. One other thing to keep in mind is, if you are using a pick or a probing tool to shim these, if you're not holding against the face of the plug when you get on that last chamber and your hook or your half diamond or whatever is caught on a pin, well, once you shim that last chamber, your pick can actually pull it out. Now, a lot of times that's not necessarily a bad thing, but in cases where you've got a 6-pin cylinder like this one, if it was only pinned to 5 chambers, well, as soon as that 6th chamber runs into the top pin in the 5th chamber, it's going to lock it up, and you're not going to have a good day. So if you're using a probe, a pick tool, something like that, when you get to that last one, you're going to want to hold your finger against the face of the plug so that when it does shim, it doesn't come flying out. Go over a few other quick things, and I've already got this one shimmed. This is a Everest C123. Again, you can use an Everest 123 C123, let me be specific, key blank to shim it. But what happens is, once you get to the very end, and I've got all 6, I actually just locked it up and I don't want to go through it again, but once you get all 6 shimmed, it's still not going to turn, and the reason that is because of the check pin. So very simply, once you have all 6 shimmed, all you got to do is, while holding the plug with one hand, press down and then rotate the plug. And if I hadn't miffed it up just then, I would have been able to do that. But just something to keep in mind if you're doing any work on Everest. They can be shimmed very easily. One other thing we'll go over is Sargent, who has notoriously tight tolerance. They make a very fine cylinder. And your typical shims will work, but not as, I guess, best as what they call sergeant shims, which are shims themselves, but much thinner than typical shims, and I know you're not going to be able to tell the difference. But they help facilitate in those tight tolerances. And I don't know if I'll be able to even do this because people are watching and I get all nervous. But you feed it in through the back, and that very thin shim is going to help you work through the pin stacks. Now it's very thin and very flimsy, so it's very prone to bending if you apply too much pressure to it. So you got to exercise extra special caution, I guess you could say, when using it. And a lot of that happens or can be prevented by where you put your fingers on the back. Obviously you don't want to be back out here because, see, that'll just happen. You want to kind of be closer to the back of the plug itself. And now I'm not even going to be able to do it because I got that kink in there. And, I mean, you can see how easy they bend if you're not careful. Give it a few more seconds before I say no, I'm not going to do it anymore. Try another one. See, as where before I was able to get in about 3 or 4. Well, there we go. It's a little bit tighter with this one, but possible. Well, I'm not going to be able to get it now. Oh, there we go. But I guess I'll use this example in a second to show you another trick you can do if you're having trouble with these. Give it a few more seconds before I admit defeat. There it went. Okay, so let's say that it was really kicking my butt that day, and maybe I only got to the, if viewing from the front, in the forwardmost chamber would be considered 1, and then 2, and then all the way down the line. Let's say it's kicking my butt and I can only get to maybe chamber 2 or 3. Okay, well then you can use your normal picking techniques to compensate for that lack of ability, which happens to the best of us, don't worry. And actually pick it as if it were a 3 or 2 pin cylinder. But now I'm kind of getting to quasi-bypass territory. But the fact remains, if you get caught up on the last few chambers, you can always pick it. Got to be careful, though, same way as if you were using a pick or a probe to shim these, is if you're not careful, that plug will come right out. And then you're not going to have a good day. As you can see, the back pin's already on it. But that's basically all there is to shimming. That's my technique, at least. Just very light pressure. While you're holding it, you want to keep your fingers as close to the back of the plug as possible so that we don't get that bending or anything like that. Some of these key and lever cylinders can be really tight sometimes, and I've found that if you put the cylinder into a vise and tighten it on the sides, or basically 9 and 3 o'clock, and very carefully tighten it down a little bit. Kind of the same effect when you squeeze a tennis ball. If you squeeze a tennis ball on the sides, what happens? Well, the other sides protrude outward. Well, the same thing is going to happen with the cylinder itself. We're going to squeeze on these sides, and the top and the bottom will move away from the plug itself, and that can help us get a little bit of extra room in there. But like I said, you got to be very careful. We don't want to deform or alter the cylinder to where it's not going to be functioning as it should be. It just takes a little bit of pressure to get that extra bit you need. But other than that, make sure you use your lubricant. Make sure you have the right shims. Take care of your shims. I've seen a lot of people, you go into their truck or whatever, and their dang shims look like that. Don't do that. You can take care of your stuff. I mean, I know they're pennies on the dollar, but you can get some really good use out of them if you take care of them. But other than that, I've got an article that I'll include in the video description that I wrote for the national locksmith, rest in peace, that went over shimming and maybe cover some details I didn't think to cover today. It's always easier to get all your thoughts out when you can write, review, and all that, as opposed to ad-lib on the fly. But I will post that in as well, because as far as I know, I didn't sign any sort of exclusivity agreement, and it's my intellectual property, so I will do with it as I please. But hopefully that kind of helps you a little bit out with shimming. Not hard, and it's a necessary skill that you need to be proficient at, especially if you're servicing cylinders, rekeying, whatnot. Other than that, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. As always, visit lockreference.com. We've got tons of great tools, charts, resources, whatever that'll help you out with your job. Thanks.